Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, everybody's talking about World War II right now because of Masters of the Air, and I wanted to take a look at some myths that sometimes people believe from World War II because of Hollywood. And I know in talking to a lot of my British friends, for example, that one of the things they really hate is how often in TV shows and movies there's this portrayal of the United States kind of coming in and saving the day and winning the war all by itself. And the British are always these snotty people who look down on everyone else and those kinds of stereotypes. And of course, me being somebody who loves the UK but is an American, I don't really see that as much as they do. But I guess we're all a little biased toward our own side of things. So I'm interested to see what is covered in this video from TopTenz, which is one of Simon's many channels. This is top 10 World War II myths you believe because of Hollywood. As always, I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive in.
During the Second World War, the US government combined with two other major influences of public opinion, Hollywood and Madison Avenue, to support the war effort. Propaganda flowed through both industries until it saturated American daily life. In Great Britain, Churchill's stirring rhetoric spurred patriotic feeling, affecting the English-speaking peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. In newsreels, films, radio broadcasts, newspaper and magazine articles, information about the war supplanted all other news and entertainment. The result was inaccuracies and misinformation entering the public's consciousness, where it has remained ever since. Information meant to boost morale gradually became accepted facts, despite the inherent inaccuracies dictated by war conditions.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because sometimes the inaccuracies are intentional. Sometimes things are spun a certain way. Sometimes it's not necessarily untrue, but it's so heavily focused on certain things that it can lead to people believing that certain things are only that way when there was another side to it. Sometimes it's just because so much of the stuff was made, like there were movies being made while the war was going on. Sometimes it was just not having all the information. You know, some of the stuff that we know about history today, we only found out decades later after some of the events took place, or even longer. So our understanding of events is constantly evolving based on new information that we find. It's not revisionist history. It's just better understanding the history with more information added to what we already know. So it's a mix of all of those things.
Many remain in the public mind, though they have long been disproven. Fighting Hollywood has never been easy when attempting to correct the historical record, so here are 10 myths about World War II, either created or long maintained by the entertainment industry. Number 10. Americans supported rationing on the home front wholeheartedly. American life during World War II is portrayed in films and television as one of unity and unflagging support for the troops and the government fighting the war. Often, they are depicted humorously, such as films using housing shortages to set up romantic comedies. The effects of rationing, when they are presented at all, are seen as being mere inconveniences. Americans stoically and even enthusiastically supported rationing as their willing contributions to the war effort, according to film. In reality, rationing was almost universally resented and widely subverted through the black markets which thrived during the war. Hundreds of items were rationed during the war, and ration books and prices changed frequently. Americans resented the need to budget both ration coupons and cash to purchase items they perceived to be widely available. Among the items most widely purchased via black markets or counterfeit ration coupons were meat, sugar, and gasoline. One enterprising journalist purchased over a ton of black market beef, all within a 30-mile radius of Pittsburgh in just a few hours. During the war, the government produced scores of posters denouncing black markets and encouraging Americans to refuse to patronize those merchants who cheated the system. Their existence and the efforts of the Office of Price Administration, OPA, to suppress black marketeers and rationing cheats throughout the war stand as clear evidence to the range of rationing resistance within America during the war. Number 9.
So what I'll do is I'll let each one of these play all the way through, and then I'll just stop at the end of it before he goes into the next one, and we'll talk about it. Yeah, obviously, nobody was happy about rationing. You wouldn't expect anybody to be like, yes, we have to sacrifice. But I think a lot of people did understand it, even if they didn't like it. And you can't really expect the government to be making videos for public consumption of people complaining about rationing. You're obviously going to focus on the people who are going to speak in favor of something that's going to help you. Is that propaganda? I guess technically it is, because it's not telling the whole story. I don't think it's necessarily a lie if you're showing people who really do feel that way. I totally get why people did that. I don't know. I guess I've never really felt like people were universally in support of rationing during the war. Maybe we'll get to some more significant ones than that, but I get why there would be a focus on making films that support the war effort. It just makes sense. And they hired a lot of Hollywood people to do this. Ronald Reagan was in the military during World War II, but he didn't fight. He actually narrated a lot of those films that were made during the war. They wanted Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart and others to do the same thing, but like Jimmy Stewart actually flew bombing missions over Germany during World War II. Clark Gable flew a few bombing missions as well as a observer and a tail. I think he was a tail gunner. I think he was a gunner, and did like 5 combat missions. And then his studio kind of convinced the government to pull him off of combat duty.
Germany possessed a highly mechanized army which overwhelmed the Allies early in the war. The perception born in the media in the early days of the war that the German army was a heavily mechanized, armored juggernaut remains a facet of films set in World War II. When the war began, the German army, the Heer, consisted of about 135 divisions. Only 16 of those divisions were fully mechanized. The others had a few motorized vehicles, such as staff cars for officers and motorcycles for messengers. The German army, which rapidly swept over most of Western and Eastern Europe, was a horse-drawn army, dependent upon animal transport to move its equipment, supplies, ammunition, and heavy guns. When the Germans invaded France in 1940, the French had more tanks, and most of them were more powerful than their German enemies. They also possessed more heavy guns and about the same number of troops. What allowed the Germans to prevail over the French in a relatively short campaign was the highly innovative tactics developed and deployed by the Heer, as well as the air superiority achieved by the Luftwaffe. Yet the image still remains of the highly mechanized German army overwhelming its enemies by sheer number of tanks and armored vehicles. Throughout the war, about 75 to 80% of German combat troops relied on animal transport in the field and rail transports to and from the battlefronts. Number 8.
Yeah, absolutely true. It was all about tactics for the Germans. The French did have a more powerful army on paper than the Germans did. The Germans just surprised them. They surprised them by putting tanks through areas that the French didn't think tanks could go through. And by the time they even realized what was happening, the Germans were already behind them. It was all about surprise, the kind of shock and awe sort of thing. One thing, a statistic that really surprised me when I read, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you can look it up, is I think it was actually in a book that I read recently. They talked about the number of people by country who had familiarity with driving a motor vehicle of some kind. And in the United States, it was by far so much more frequent than it was in any other place, including Germany, where like a really small percentage of people even owned automobiles or knew how to operate one. So even just the number of people who knew how to drive things like tanks and trucks was relatively small and had to be trained up. Now, that's not to say that the Germans didn't eventually develop a much, much bigger army, but in 1939, it wasn't there yet.
The American military was made up of eager, patriotic volunteers. American conscription during World War II began in 1940, just over 1 year before the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the war. Following that attack, there was a brief surge of enlistments, but by early 1942, the draft was fully established as the portal of entry into the US military. Americans registered in the draft were assigned a draft number. Numbers to be inducted were selected by lottery drawn at random. Those selected were instructed to report to their draft boards for induction. 2/3 of the American men who served in the military during the war were conscripted, drafted into military service based on needs rather than patriotism. In comparison, during the Vietnam War, about 1/3 of troops were drafted. Draft exemptions were decided for the most part by the local draft boards. They were made up of prominent local businessmen and political figures. As in all wars in which conscription was used to recruit American troops, there was resistance and abuses of the system were not uncommon. Number 7.
Yeah, I will say this about the draft, though. It got to a place where the United States military actually stopped volunteer enlistments and only did drafts. And the reason for that, among other things, was that when people volunteered, they got to pick where they served, if they were in the tank corps or the airborne or in the Navy or in the Army Air Corps, things like that. And the problem was that people volunteered for the more popular choices and needs weren't being filled in other areas. And so they stopped volunteer enlistment altogether. And the only way that people entered at that point was by the draft, so that they could make sure that people were getting where they needed to be.
Rommel was an ardent anti-Nazi who opposed Hitler and led a noble campaign with his Afrika Korps. It is true that Erwin Rommel, arguably the most famous German commander during World War II, was not a member of the Nazi Party, but it is equally true that Rommel personally supported Hitler, was a long member of his inner circle, and even commanded his personal guard during the Polish campaign. In film, he is frequently depicted as the brilliant commander of the German Afrika Korps. His most brilliant operation was a 1,400-mile retreat, eluding numerically superior British forces. Rommel's legends began during the war, presented to the German people as propaganda from Joseph Goebbels to raise morale. Following the war, British and American sources added to the myth of both his battlefield brilliance and his participation in the war as a good German, as in a professional officer and a gentleman. The distinction was necessary to the Western Allies in post-war Europe as justification for restoring the West German army, considered a Cold War necessity. Rommel did perform spectacularly in command in France and North Africa early in the war, and it was he who supervised the construction of most of the Atlantic Wall, the German defenses against the Allied invasion of France. Yet he fully supported Hitler through most of the war and did not support assassinating the Fuhrer. His legend was born largely through German propaganda, Churchillian rhetoric, and concerted revision of history by the Allies in the post-war era. Number 6.
Yeah, I mean, that's all true. Really not a lot I can say about that. It's still debated whether or not he had knowledge of the July plot against Hitler in 1944. It's almost certainly clear that he wasn't an active participant in it, but he may have known something about it. And it's fair to think that Rommel, like a lot of higher-ups, even within Hitler's inner circle, by late in the war, was fairly disillusioned with how things were going and with the leadership at that point. But he never really spoke out real vocally against it, and he ends up having to take his own life because of the implication of him in the plot against Hitler. And they have this big funeral for him, and the propaganda continues. We do that, though, especially with figures who die in the middle of the war that makes them famous. We tend to mythologize them a lot more. Look at who we mythologize from the past, right? Rommel from World War II, and part of that is the whole clean Wehrmacht myth, this idea that the SS and the Nazis were bad, but the regular German army, they were all great and they hated the Nazis and that kind of stuff. Did that exist? Absolutely, and that's far too much to go into in this video, but the idea that they were all good and honorable, I mean, there were dishonorable people in every army, but Patton, we mythologize quite a bit. He died right at the end of World War II. We mythologize Stonewall Jackson because he died in the middle of the Civil War. We mythologize John F. Kennedy because he was assassinated. And so there's always that what-if factor, what would have happened afterwards, and did they reach their full potential, and what might have changed if they had lived, and Rommel's no different.
The Germans were obsessed with George
Patton,
regarding him as the Allies' most feared commander. The 1970 Academy Award-winning biopic Patton, starring George C. Scott as the flamboyant American general, depicts an infatuation by his German adversaries with his wehrmacht.
It does.
The portrayal of a German command structure obsessed with the activities of the man they viewed as the most feared of all the Allied commanders. Patton would have certainly endorsed such an image, but post-war analysis has long indicated the Germans held Patton in no such awe. In fact, prior to his assuming command of the Third Army in 1944, they paid little attention to him at all. Patton was a master of self-promotion, one of the first American commanders to include a press officer as a member of his staff. He dressed flamboyantly, often wearing riding breeches and boots. He wore ivory-gripped pistols and adopted a highly polished helmet with his general stars prominently displayed. In Sicily, he used his pistols to personally shoot 2 mules blocking a bridge and made certain that war correspondents accompanying his troops knew about it. In a book he wrote, Between the World Wars, The Secret of Victory, Patton wrote, "The leader must be an actor. He is unconvincing unless he lives his part." Patton spent his World War II years living his part, frequently to the exasperation of his superiors. But to his German adversaries, he was simply a prima donna, not a commander that they feared. above all others.
I will say this. First of all, the movie. A lot of the events that you see in the movie did happen pretty much the way they're shown. The movie gets a lot of things right. The biggest thing the movie gets wrong, other than what he just mentioned about how the Germans were kind of obsessed with Patton as the best leader in the Allies, is Patton himself. I think I love George C. Scott as Patton. I think he captures the ethos of Patton brilliantly. But the voice is very different. Patton did not have a gruff, kind of gravelly, tough-sounding voice. He actually kind of talked like this. I mean, that's a really poor imitation of it, but he had a kind of a high voice, not at all a tough-sounding guy. There's a couple of videos of him speaking toward the end of the war. You can see that. But he was a tough dude. I will say this. The Allies obviously thought something of the German thoughts about Patton, because they put him in command of a fictitious army to convince the Germans that he was going to be in charge of the army that made the landings that were going to happen supposedly at Calais. So they must have thought that the Germans thought highly enough of him to put him in command of that army. Yeah, a lot of the myth of Patton, a lot of what he did that really made a mark for himself happens after D-Day, when he's given Third Army and when they kind of race across France. But he did do some things well in North Africa and in Sicily. And for the first 2 years of the war, he's probably the most accomplished American general. But he couldn't get out of his own way. Incidents in Sicily and things he said to the press, stuff like that, kind of hurt him in the long run. But brilliant, dashing, confident commander, but also an insecure man at times. When you read a lot of the stuff that he wrote in his journals, very insecure, very concerned about what people thought of him, stuff like that.
Number 5. After the fall of France, Great Britain stood alone against Germany. In film after film depicting the fall of France at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, emphasis is placed on the British standing alone against the might of Germany and their Italian allies. The myth of Britain's lone stand against what Churchill described as Nazi tyranny began with his speeches to Parliament and to the British people at the time. In many of them, he was actually speaking to the American people, hoping through his rhetoric to exploit traditional American sympathy for the underdog. But Britain did not stand alone following their retreat from Dunkirk and other Channel ports and the subsequent surrender of the French. In 1940, the British Empire covered more than 25% of the globe. Britain could and did draw resources and men from Canada, India, Asia, South Africa, Rhodesia, Australia, New Zealand, and its islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere. The Empire held vast reserves of oil, rubber, coal, iron ore, and foodstuffs from around the world. Churchill's rhetoric and the jingoistic recording of history in the post-war era led to the creation of the Britain stood alone myth. A simple review of the facts reveals that myth is romantic nonsense. Even the deservedly idolized pilots of the RAF were not simply British standing alone against Hitler. Pilots from South Africa, Rhodesia, Netherlands, Poland, France, Belgium, Canada, and even volunteers from the United States all flew with the Royal Air Force during Britain's darkest hour. Number 4.
I'll say this about that. Territorially speaking, in Europe, Britain was standing alone. They were the only part of Europe that was fighting against the Germans that hadn't been conquered at that point. So I wouldn't go so far as to say, no, they weren't standing alone because they had their whole empire. I get it. I get why it seems that way. But also, this, again, was about propaganda. This is about Churchill trying to build up the morale of the British people about how they were standing alone against Nazi tyranny. And yeah, in some of his speeches, you can tell he's directly calling out the Americans, because when he talked about how even if Britain was conquered, he without saying the United States by name, he implied that they would eventually figure it out and they would come to their rescue and take it back for them. So all of this is about psyche and propaganda and morale and boosting your willingness to stand and fight. So I wouldn't call that one strictly a myth. There is some truth to the whole standing alone thing.
The Battle of Britain was David and Goliath events with the British a decided underdog. During the Battle of Britain, the aerial campaign, which attempted to induce Britain to surrender or face invasion, several advantages were held by the British. First, and probably most decisive, was Britain's advanced early warning radar, communications and control systems, which allowed the RAF to scramble fighters and vector them to intercept incoming German aircraft. Chain home stations, made operational just before the war, gave the British a decided advantage, allowing them to keep aircraft on the ground until they were needed, rather than expending precious fuel in patrols. Most of the air-to-air combat which took place during the battle did so in British skies. Men who had to abandon their aircraft and bail out, for the most part, landed in Britain or Scotland, or in the waters nearby.
That's key.
RAF pilots could quickly return to duty once any injuries healed. German pilots became prisoners of war, most of whom eventually were sent to Canada for the duration. German aircraft consumed considerable amounts of fuel just to arrive over Britain, and were thus limited in the time available for combat before they had to disengage and return to base. The Battle of Britain took its name from yet another speech by Winston Churchill, intended in a decisive defeat for the Germans and humiliation for Hermann Goering's Luftwaffe. It remains a battle surrounded with myths and misconceptions, but it was never a David versus Goliath affair. About 2,900 fighter pilots flew for the RAF during the battle, roughly the same number as did for the Germans. Of those 2,900, about 20% came from nations other than Britain, including exiled Europeans, pilots from the Empire, and American volunteers. Number 3.
So, yeah, I agree it was less David and Goliath than sometimes people think, but what the British had going for them was a major home field advantage. All the stuff he just mentioned. They were fighting at home. They could concentrate on where the attacks were coming and not have to cover everything all at once. Their pilots, if they got shot down and survived, could get another plane to fly, whereas Germans were captured. All of that absolutely helped. There were also some serious mistakes made by Hermann Goering in leading the Luftwaffe, where there were moments when the Germans probably could have won the Battle of Britain, but made critical errors at critical times. And the one thing I'll take a little bit of exception with is he said that basically they were trying to force the British to surrender. I think Hitler would have been perfectly content not with British surrender, but with the British just negotiating a peace and saying, we're out. I don't think Hitler felt the need to conquer the British Isles. He just didn't want to have to fight them anymore. He would have been fine with them saying, we're done, white peace, we're out of this. But that was never going to happen, certainly not with Churchill in charge.
German war crimes were committed by the SS and Gestapo, not the Wehrmacht. Beginning in the 1950s, as the extent of German war crimes continued to be revealed, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht emerged. Reinforced by films and television programs, the myth holds that the Gestapo and the Waffen-SS committed war crimes across Europe without the participation or even the knowledge of the Wehrmacht. By the way, Wehrmacht refers to the German military, comprised during World War II of the Heer, the Army, the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. In post-war Europe, as it became apparent the Soviets had no intention of withdrawing from the countries they overran during the war, the Western Allies needed to strengthen their positions. The creation of a West German army was encouraged. With the support of Western leaders, including Eisenhower, the German military was absolved of guilt for war crimes during the war, with all blame being assigned to the Nazi SS and Gestapo. The clean Wehrmacht was born out of Cold War necessity. The myth remains, but it's false. Here troops engaged in war crimes against civilians from the earliest days of the campaign in Poland in 1939. They were rationalized as necessary for security against partisan attacks or as simply obeying orders, but they were nonetheless war crimes willingly committed. Not every German soldier committed war crimes, of course, but every branch of the German military, as well as the German paramilitary units, did.
Yeah, and it's important to note that a number of Wehrmacht generals and other members of the military were executed for war crimes that they were absolutely aware of and in many cases ordered to have happen. Some guys got away with it, though. Guys like Joachim Peiper, whose men very famously committed the Malmedy massacre. But you know what? There were things like that happened under Patton, for example. The 11th Armored Division, during the Battle of the Bulge, massacred a bunch of German soldiers. It got brushed under the rug. This was... The clean Wehrmacht is not a German-only invention. Before the war was even over, people were already thinking about the post-war world and the big showdown that was going to happen between the Soviets and the Western Allies, who right now it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but once the enemy is taken out, there were a lot of Germans who thought that they could get the Western Allies to team up with them to take out the Soviets. That was kind of how things were viewed. And while the Western Allies weren't going to go that far, they did need to think about a post-war world where they were going to need Germans on their side. And the three areas that became West Germany, the three occupation zones for the French, the British, and the Americans, required that some of these guys who were high-ranking Wehrmacht officers were going to have to continue to be in the West German army, and a lot of them did continue to serve.
2. The atomic bomb caused the Japanese to surrender. The Japanese surrendered because of the atomic bombs which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every film which covers the end of the Pacific War says so. In many, an image of a mushroom cloud precedes scenes of people celebrating in Times Square. What isn't covered is the fact that the 2 atomic bombings were not the most devastating bombing raids on Japan during the war.
True.
Over 60 Japanese cities had already been destroyed by bombing raids, including the dreaded fire bombings, which terrorized the civilian population. There were many factors which allowed Japan to accept surrender, though the supposed unconditional surrender included several conditions which they insisted upon. One was the right to keep the emperor on his throne. Another was the withdrawal of Soviet troops following their declaration of war on Japan and invasion of Manchuria. The Soviet invasion created a two-front war for the Japanese, who had already lost their fleet and most of their air forces. Japan was beaten before the atomic
picture
bombs
of Nagasaki
dropped,
there.
The 2 bombings and the threat of more to come certainly helped convince them to stop fighting a war they'd clearly lost. They had no food, no oil, and few medicines. It was clear by then to even the most rabid warmonger among them that the Americans would not quit and the Russians were coming. In the end, it was the emperor who agreed to surrender and speak directly to his people for the first time in history. Number 1.
Yeah, and he still nearly faced a coup. I mean, there was an attempt by some of the higher-ups in the military who did not want a surrender to happen, and they tried to overthrow the government to keep it from happening. This is one of those ones that you can't really say one way or the other. We will never be able to fully quantify and objectively state what the specific reasons were that Japan surrendered. It was a number of factors. He's right. The firebombing was incredibly devastating, and the cities we chose to drop the atomic bombs on were cities that hadn't really been hit too heavily by the firebombing yet. The Soviet Union declaring war was a huge factor for sure. I think it's all of it. I think the atomic bombs certainly helped push them over the top in terms of surrender, but were they the sole and deciding factor? No.
Hitler's biggest mistake was a repeat of Napoleon's invading Russia in 1941. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was not just a mistake, it was the opening salvo in what became a series of mistakes made one after the other for the rest of the war. The invading Germans carried no winter uniforms or equipment, expecting a quick campaign. They had reason to expect such, as up until then all of their land campaigns had been successful, completed quickly and efficiently. Obviously, the war with the Soviets broke that mold, but it was not Hitler's biggest mistake. That error was his decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 in accordance with his perception of the Tripartite Pact. Interestingly, the Japanese did not respond in kind and declare war on the Soviet Union, then at war with Germany. Hitler declared war even though American President Franklin D. Roosevelt had not mentioned Germany or Hitler in his declaration of war on Japan. American outrage was directed at Japan, not Germany. Hitler made it easy for Roosevelt and the United States to enter the war and adopt the policy of destroying Germany first.
Yep.
Hitler's rash decision ensured that the Allies would gain control of the Atlantic sea lanes and the industrial might of the United States would arm his enemies. Already in a death grip with the Soviet Union, the Germans then faced the largest industrial economy in the world. His attack on the Soviet Union ensured a long and brutal war. His declaration of war on the United States would ensure he would lose it.
I'm not sure if I feel like it was a bigger mistake to declare war on the United States than the Soviet Union. I still say the Soviet Union was the bigger mistake to make. Number one, because he had a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and I think that probably would have held for a while. I understand that ideologically it was like a core Nazi tenet to hate the Bolsheviks, as they called them. And they were a natural enemy that at some point he just was going to go over just because of who he was and because of who they were as Nazis. But the United States, while not actively putting combat troops on the ground, was certainly helping already financially, economically, in terms of supplies, ammunition, weapons, those kinds of things, the Allies in Europe already. So, and really, North Africa was pretty minor in the grand scheme of things as far as the number of troops that were involved. It's not until you get to Italy in 1943 that the U.S. is in any substantial way contributing militarily other than the bombing raids. And you can argue whether or not those made a huge difference in things. So I really, 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 truly believe that the Soviet Union was the much bigger mistake in terms of declarations of war. But that's, again, one of those things we can debate and talk about. So let me know your thoughts about everything we just talked about in the comment section below. Let's have a discussion. Let's learn from each other. Let's debate in a civil way what we agree with, what we disagree with each other. Thanks for watching.